If you can believe it, TFT Set 12 is almost over. They're already teasing Set 13, showing off champions such as Powder from Arcane, which will heavily hint towards Set 13 being Arcane themed. Shocked Pikachu.jpg. But there's still 2 weeks left, and this is a pretty balanced patch. So let's go ahead and dive in one last time to the TFT Academy tier list and find out what are the new comps and what's on top. Before we start with S tier, I kind of want to explain a little bit macro of how S tier is working. Right now, S tier is very thin because the meta is actually quite close to being balanced. Balanced in the sense that there are a lot of different ways that you can win, and there are a ton of comps available. But S tier is just generally a slight cut above right now, and that's really important to note because in other metas, S tier was way above everything else. And so these S tiers are actually pretty close to A tier, which Dishop and I talked about in our latest episode of Study Hall, so you definitely should check that out. You might also notice that S tier basically has like 3 variations where you're playing Bastions, Ryze, and some variations of Scholars. So for example, we have Scholar Ryze here, we have Portal Ryze with an emblem, we have Bastion Ahri, who also can play around Ryze secondary carry, and Ryze also here with Witchcraft. And that's because this patch, they buffed Bastions and they buffed some of the core units like Ahri, so that way it improves your early mid game and giving you a lot of cheap options. So if you go here and click the variations tab on number 3, you'll see that this is what you usually can play with Ryze without any emblems. You just play a basic 4 Bastion, 4 Scholar core, and you just kind of play like a simple level 8 board. And this is like good enough to top 4 a lot of times if you just have good Ryze items and you're able to kind of push levels and find the Taric too. And the core concept to take away is that Bastions are 1, very effective because they buff them. 2, they're very cheap. You have Poppy, Lilia, Nunu, Shen, and you can build like very reasonable early mid games around them. And they have really good traits that can like activate. So, you know, a Hecarimal can let you splash in the Arcana. Poppy always lets you get Witchcraft in. Shen always lets you get like an extra Pyro unit in. And so you just have a lot of other ways you can kind of flex in and ends up being very powerful. So that actually brings us to our first comp, which is Scholar Ryze Flex. And specifically, if you can find 6 Scholar is what brings it to be S tier. They did end up nerfing the ability heal and some of their best augments like Little Buddies and Combat Caster, but it's still really top end. And instead of being like S+, it's like that S tier that's still very much going to win a lot of games. And because they buffed Ahri, they gave a lot of extra power to the early mid game to stabilize, so that way you can get to level 8 and 9 safely. Ryze is also really well positioned in the metagame because some of his weakest matchups are less popular. He really struggled with a lot of melee carries that can rush him, like Warriors. Fiora Karma, for example, never really let him ramp up because Gwen and Fiora would ambush Ryze and make his life really difficult. And then Ryze is also really well positioned to snipe other people's backlines. A lot of people are playing Reroll right now in this meta, and Ryze is going to be able to actually get past those super insane 3-star Blitzcranks, 3-star Vexes, 3-star Mordekaisers, and snipe the backline. And then once he snipes the backline, he can focus fire the front line and eliminate them. So Ryze is probably, I would say, the best 4-cost carry to play around currently in the meta. He's powerful, he's flexible, great matchups. His itemization actually is pretty dynamic. Like, you don't have to always just play like the AP items. You can play like Shiv, Morello, support DPS Ryze, and duo carry somebody else like, Milio, Ahri, etc. And the best part is you can always get spatulas for Portal, or you can play him in Witchcraft, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And you can also just use the Pan for a Scholar. So he's just really good even in high variance portals like Loot Subscription or Prismatic Party. So right now, I would probably say overall, look to play Ryze a lot in this current meta if you feel like you want to go to 8 and you have good AP items. They finally did it and buffed Ahri enough for her to be quite powerful. And now she is back to being one of the princesses of the meta. Because they buffed both Bastion and they buffed Ahri, it's just really powerful if you get a setup where you have like a really powerful way to get 3 stars easily, or you have like insane augments like Spellcaster's Toolbox, which just helps Ahri ramp up like insane. Learning the spell, upgrade adventure, like any of these like big juicers, prismatic tickets that can just help you get this comp online. It is so powerful, and RE3 will wipe a lot of boards. And so this is probably one of the big winners of the patch. I would say Ahri in general should be played at least in your lobby by 1 player. So if no one else is playing it, you should. You don't have to play 6 Bastion. It's just nice because you can play for like Nunu 3, Lilia 3, and Poppy 3. You can go back and play like the 4 Scholar, 4 Bastion variations if you hit like Ryze and Milio. But part of what makes this really good is that you get the Arcana charm onto Ahri and you just get a ton of AP. 2 variations that I can show you very quickly is that you also play the hero augments of the cheap Bastions, Poppy and Lilia. You both play that under the same structure. So if you hit those hero augments, just look for this as well. 2 tanky is also an S tier augment. It's just really, really powerful. In fact, if you look right now at 2-1, the best starting augment you can have at 2-1 at Masters Plus is straight up 2 tanky. So it's very, very good. And it even gets better at 3-2, so it's quite insane. There's actually a few ways you can play 2 Tanky Honeymancy. The general premise is that you basically have a super tank in the form of Blitzcrank 3 or maybe Nunu 3. And then you have like Honey with your backline and you just put out a bunch of damage while 3-starring everything. In this variation, we're showing double Kog'Maw. And if you do play double Kog'Maw, you want to put items on both. One Kog'Maw ideally holds the utility while the carry holds all the damage items. But there's also possibilities that you play, for example, 2 tanky Ziggs instead. And you play Ziggs, Kog'Maw, Vhagar, and you go Blitzcrank, Blitzcrank, Nunu, Nunu. And then there's also variations where you can play of like Vhagar with 2 tanky, and then you play 5 Honeymancy, and you play Vex plus Galio. But there's also variations where you can play 2 tanky Vhagar mages, where you go for a Galio with either 2 tanky Galio, or maybe you play 5 Honeymancy and eventually like find a way to play Nora. So it's very dynamic with how you actually want to play it. This is just like one example of how to play into, say, like the Hunter variations where you focus on Kog'Maw. Difficulty Gold is actually underrating it because 2 tanky in itself is just so powerful that you can play so many variations. So have fun with it. And basically remember always to 2 tanky your front line, but you don't need a 2 tanky your back line. Like you don't need 2 Vhagars and you don't need 2 Ziggs because 2 tanky is a health buff. The reason why you play 2 Kog'Maws is because they buff each other and they give a bunch of attacks to your whole team. If you're looking for Zap Attack and like how to play around that, you still can just play this without 2 tanky and play like the old school Ziggs Blitzcrank reroll and try to also duo carry Cassiopeia. One of the things that we kind of figured out with this comp is that Ziggs is actually the carry in the early game and Cassiopeia is like the late game carry. So what ends up happening is like stage 3 and most of 4, Ziggs ends up doing a lot of the damage. Then stage 5 onwards, you need Cassiopeia 3 with items in order to actually get it home. Just kind of driving that you need a lot of items to make this work. The other variation you can play is a cheap Vanguard Hogmaw Hunter. And this is like another variation of Kog'Maw you can play. It's basically what happens if you get a Vanguard emblem. You put like the Vanguard on Nunu. You roll for like Hogmaw, Nunu, Blitz 3. And this is like a way you can play for top 4 just by being aggressive and pushing the tempo by making sure that you're strong for stage 3 and stage 4. Usually you play this variation if you find yourself like contested or you just have like a bunch of Kog'Maws or just better items for Kog'Maws. Like you're not getting things like the Rageblade and Runins. You have like tears and a bunch of gloves and you kind of like need to make this work. You can just slam items on Kog'Maw and try to make that work instead. Last of the S tier is Witchcraft Flex, and we'll go through a couple of variations to show you. The strongest is Ryze for the variations that we mentioned. Ryze is just the best 4-cost carry that can both deal with frontline and backline. And it ties in very nicely because you have the Bastion with Taric and you have Zoe with here to make Portal. This Milio spot is actually pretty flexible. You can actually play Briar as well. And Briar ends up being a really good holder of more 80 items if you end up in that situation. 8 Witchcraft is probably the best non-10 piece trait in the game. So like, 10 Portal, 10 Eldritch, 10 Mages all win the game, but right below that, you have 9 Fairy, 8 Witchcraft, and then like everything else. So 8 Witchcraft is definitely worth playing. The 2 variations to show, you can play Karma for 1. Karma is an incanter that ties in with Cassio, and then you would tech in Zillion as a Chrono and Preserver. And then the other variation you can play, if you're missing on that, is play for Gwen and try to just flex with Gwen and Briar. You can also play Nasus and just trying to play like a Warrior Preserver line, but flexing more into the Witchcraft area. A lot of really good comps are in A tier, but they're just like a little bit less consistent. I can explain to you why with each comp. So starting off with Dragon Shapeshifters, this composition was something that I made a video about recently, and it was a composition that started taking over because Shyvana 2 was insanely good. And now they nerfed Shyvana pretty significantly, but the top end is really powerful. Basically, this is a fast 9 composition, and Shyvana 2 helps you fast 9 very reliably. Now, Shyvana is weaker, but if you can find a way to get to the end game board state, you still very often will win the game if you get Smolder 2 and Briar 2. It's just that the path is a lot rockier now. You absolutely need like a ton of econ for this. I don't think this comp is very playable without econ of some sort, and either that's through the portal or your augments. But you also need like a lot of items as well, which is really tricky. You really want to have like items for Smolder and Briar and like Shyvana, so you can't really do that without items. And usually early game, you really want to play this only if you have like Namze 2 and Twitch 2 with like Frost and Dragons. You can play Reroll Namzi with Draconic Mastery or Upgrade Venture, but in general, I would probably stay away from this variation unless you have like specifically these two augments. One point of debate is whether or not you should actually put items on Varus 2 versus Smolder 1. Let's say you have Varus 2, but you hit Smolder 1, should you immediately transfer items? I personally think so, unless you're in a spot where the items just fit Varus a little bit better. Obviously, if you have like Shojin, Infinity Edge, and for some reason you have like Red Buff, even though you're playing Dragons, that's like much better items for Varus. But if you have like Rage Blade, get that Rage Blade off of Varus and put that on Smolder 1. Mages got nerfed pretty heavily this patch. They nerfed their augments and they nerfed a lot of the traits. That being said, if you still get the start for like learning to spell mages, that is the best ideal situation. And I think most people would just prefer to go for Soraka Seraphine reroll rather than Vanguard 3 right now. That's because right now, this patch, reroll tempo in the lobby is so high that it feels like it's going to take too long for you to get Vanguard 2 and Vex 2 online. So a lot of people are just going to try to prioritize like fighting Soraka 2, Seraphine 2 early, and then rolling for 3 stars on stage 3 to win consistently. And then if you find yourself in a situation where you hit Veigar 3 late game, then you transfer items from Seraphine or Soraka to Veigar, and you duo carry like, you know, one of these units, and you just give leftover items to the remaining 3-star. The other variation that people are playing right now are Vanguard mages, and this ends up kind of going back to the core point of what we said before, which was Vex 3 and Veigar 3 take a really long time to get online. They kind of get pushed over a lot on stage 3 until you get to stage 4, unless you are high rolling. And so one thing that people are doing is if you have like learning the spell or shields up, you can play for cheap Vanguards. And the cool thing about this is they're all 1-cost units. So Blitz 3, Warwick 3, Seraphine, Soraka 3. And if you get Ahri onto the board with Tahm Kench, you get a bunch of free AP. And that's basically what Mage gives you. If you think about what going from 3, 5, 7 Mage is, it's just a lot of AP. If you can make up that gap with like the Ahri Arcana and have a smoother curve with 1-cost Vanguards, that's basically the same as playing with, you know, more Mage AP. So this is just one variation for you to think about to play. If you just find yourself, you know, contested on Mages, for example, and you can't hit Vex 3, you look in the lobby, someone's playing Veigar Vex, you can go ahead and play Vanguard Mages instead. And of course, you can also just default to this late game variation where you're just playing for Veigar Vex and you're just not going for Seraphine or Soraka whatsoever. And so Mage is kind of a dynamic reroll line that has a lot of different options. So explore and make sure you keep yourself an open mind. Positioning does matter for this comp. Soraka targets like a small circle around the unit. So sometimes you want to put her back center, not just in the corner. And Seraphine tends to want to shoot the opposite corner. So if you're going up against like Kalistas and Jinxes and whatnot, position Seraphine on the opposite side so she can shoot all the way to the top left and try to eliminate them. Or in this case, you put her where Soraka is, you shoot to the top right. Wukong Jinx was in a super dominant position, but I think they're running into the iron wall of Bastions, and Hunters are having a hard time actually getting the resets. Hunters need to get a takedown, and so if nothing dies too fast, then you're basically not getting the Hunter trait online, and so you end up struggling a lot. But that being said, Wukong and Jinx 2 is very stable on stage 3 and stage 4, and you're able to win a lot of fights and squeeze out placements simply because you just have too much stats and you're overwhelming a bunch of people who are low rolling. Like one of the things that Hunter does the best is prey on 1-star frontline because you just activate and you kill them really quickly. Olaf jumps to the back line. Jinx with Runaan's Hurricane just shuts everything down. Speaking of Jinx items, you might notice that we put Quicksilver here, and that's just a nod to how much CC is currently in the meta game. We kind of realized that when Jinx activates Get Excited, we were noticing that if she gets stunned at all, she loses that decaying attack speed for that 5 seconds. And you just don't really get that activation of how she bursts with a bunch of her rocket damage. So people are starting to build like Quicksilver as like a halfway point between defensiveness and getting some scaling attack speed. Olaf 2 is also really important in this composition, and you basically want to just like itemize him as full offense. Don't give him things like Bloodthirster and Sterix. Give him like, you know, Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, Runaan's Hurricane. The only defensive item I really want as a priority for Olaf is Edge of Night. He's also really insane with Suspicious Trenchcoat. These are items for Wukong for spin to win, but if you don't hit spin to win, then you just probably itemize Wukong defensively. Like you end up probably playing around like the 2 Stoneplate Gargoyles and Warmogs build. That's like probably what you end up doing. This variation of Wukong that I'm showing right now, Preservers, it's a lot weaker. I wouldn't really play it very much. It's just basically like a backup option in case you slam Wukong items. And let's say you get dropped tier, rod, tier, rod, or tier, rod. Then you have to play something else. You just can't play, you know, Jinx and the Hunters. You can play Preservers with Karma instead. Multi-strikers are powerful, and the drawback of multi-strikers is that it is easy for multi-strikers to get blown up if you don't have good combat augments. Like if someone has mages and they lock onto Kassadin, he can die very quickly if you don't have good items or good combat augments. And the second is that you really want to hit 7 multi-striker, otherwise you just cap out too low because you don't get the 3% max HP every attack. So you really want to get those two things, combat augments and as well as 7 multi-striker. The most common setup is that you reroll for Kassadin. It's like a 2-cost reroll line that actually wants to go for like Ash 3 and Hecarim 3, but you roll it for all of it on 6. Once you get to 7, you basically just add Shen and you're in the Camille waiting room. If you find a way to get Camille, just play 7 multi-striker ASAP. Like if you find Camille somehow on 6, I would just level to 7 and just roll for Kassadin 3 on 7. You're still probably not going to likely get Hecarim, especially if there's a lot of Bastions currently in the metagame, but it is something worth thinking about. Like, let's say you're in a situation where you roll and you hit Kassadin 3 and you hit Ash 3 on 6 and you have like 5 Hecarims. Just hold those Hecarims, push levels. And if you see that the Hecarim players who are playing like Bastions or Kalista and they end up dying, you know, or they're close to dying, you can just hold on to your gold and then roll for Hecarim 3 once like you're down to the last 2 or 3 players. One thing to shout out is more people are picking Anger Issues, multi-strikers, and finding success. It's a very fun variation, so give it a try. You can play variations where you go for Jax 3, but I personally don't like that as much, even though they did buff Jax. He is better, but just keep in mind it's probably not as good. And this other variation plays around Hecarim as your primary. You use to push levels, and there's 2 options. You either go for Hecarim 3 very quickly and secondary carry Kalista, or you use Hecarim as a way to transition into Briar, but I generally don't like this variation very much, and it's pretty much just something that you only play once in a blue moon. We did it, chat. We finally complained so much about Kalista. She's no longer S tier. They nerfed Rakan. A lot of people thought that was probably not going to be the right thing because you wanted to nerf like the Queen's Guard armor as opposed to Rakan. But hey, the job is done. Rakan and Kalista are no longer S tier. Instead, they're actually just like a really reliable loose streak comp that plays for top 4. Surprisingly, this comp doesn't actually like win many lobbies at high elo. What ends up happening is you lose streak early game, stage 2, stage 3. Then you spike on stage 4 and you make a really big comeback. And then towards the end of stage 5, you just kind of lose 1 or 2 matchups really badly and you take like a third. But it's really, really good at doing that. So now it becomes like a top 4 comp. But the upside is that you get to actually play for things like 9 Faerie, which is still really high cap. And like I said before, which is the best trait in the game that isn't a 10 piece. It's above 8 Witchcraft. And you still actually are still playing 3 legendaries. So if you're able to get to 9, hit Morg 2, Camille 2, Amelia 2, it still can win. So it's a very reliable comp. And I think that if you slam Rageblade, and let's say you're angling for like Wukong Jinx with Rageblade, and you know, you have Stoneplate, and you're just like, well, I'm contested, what should I do? Just angle Kalista instead, and take your top 4 and get out. If you still need tips on Kalista, the video that I made previously is very much valid, so check out that Kalista video for all the tips and pointers if you need help figuring out how to play this comp. Vanguard Hwei was a comp that caught on towards the second half of last patch, and this is sort of like a old comp that was somewhat featured in the previous video that I made where K3 Soju played Vanguard Blasters, except we realized that Ezreal duo carry is inefficient because you need to have Ezreal 3 with items. So, and also Ezreal was an AD champion, and you have physical and magical damage mixing, so it's a little bit awkward because you kind of need to build Shred for both. So instead, you just duo carry Bard and Hwei, and you have Mordekaiser 3 hold tank items. What makes this board really good is that it is very powerful on just 2-star in stage 4. Surprisingly, like Hwei and Bard are really good duo carry that can actually punish a lot of backlines. Hwei ends up targeting the lowest HP units, and that ends up having good synergy with Bard, who has the missile travels between a bunch of units. So what ends up happening is Bard shoots a missile and tags a bunch of units and makes them a little bit weaker. And then Hwei targets the lowest percentage health enemies, which means the backline units that got bounced on by Bard, especially with you have things like Shiv. And so Hwei can actually like basically be a 3-cost Ryze. Not really, but kind of. And it's just like one thing to play as an AP item backup. If you slam like, you know, blue buff or Shojin, you're like, oh my god, there's no way I have enough money to play Karma. I'm just gonna die if I fast 8. You just roll for Hwei, play for a stable top 4, and get out of the lobby. Eldritch is back. They finally buffed it enough where if you get to 7 Eldritch, it is quite good. And the best part is they also made 5 Eldritch much more stable in the mid game. The best way to play Eldritch, in my opinion, is to play Reroll. You want to go for Syndra 3 and Neela 3, and ideally Mord 3, Elise 3, but, you know, it's pretty impractical sometimes to expect to hit all of this, especially Mord 3 in a Vanguard Reroll meta. But they buff, like, everything about this. They buff Eldritch, they buff Syndra, they buff Neela. Neela also is actually a big revelation. Like, we kind of know how to play Syndra, which is like, you know, Shojin, Nashers, plus like, you know, an AP item like Death Cap, Dual Gauntlet, Archangels. But Neela 3 actually kind of goes crazy. And one thing about Neela that I think people don't realize is that you don't really want things like Bloodthirster and Stairs Gauge. You kind of want like Deathblade / Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice. You just kind of want to burst with Neela now. In fact, you could probably argue that Titans also isn't that important here. Just like go for like, you know, crit Neela. It also work perfectly fine. The other half of this, though, that I want to say is that if you don't hit 7 Eldritch and you don't have an Eldritch Crest, you do end up falling off really hard late game. So it's just one of those things where you dominate early mid game, and unless you get a crazy scaling Syndra, you're just not going to succeed with only 5 Eldritch. Because it is good mid game, but late game doesn't really do well. If you want to play a tempo variation where you just push levels and you like are win streaking so hard you just can't justify rerolling, you can just play for the 4 and 5 cost. So, you know, Syndra holds items for Karma and Nami. Neela holds items for Briar, and you just push to level 9 and find Briar 2, Karma 2. Like, that board can also do pretty well, too. But that's only, like, in, you know, portals that are, like, super high econ. Maybe something like Crab Rave or Scuttle Puddle, where you can, like, afford to push Fast 9 quickly and hit Briar 2, Karma 2. Otherwise, I'd probably just reroll. Speaking of Karma, she definitely is struggling a little bit. I think the best variation of Karma still is 6 Chrono, because I think Chrono Morgana is just straight up busted. If you're able to get Chrono on Morgana and 3 items, she just clears everything. But I will say that if you don't get a Chrono emblem onto her, let's say you have a Chrono off of a target dummy, like on Trainer Golems, I think it's a lot weaker. So this is definitely like a rare comp to play. Instead, if you click this variations tab, you'll see Karma Warriors is the other suggested comp to play. And this composition is B tier because you need to hit everything. It's very expensive. It's hard to stabilize. If you have like Karma 2, but Gwen 1, Fiora 1, you're going to die. If you have Karma 2, Fiora 2, and Gwen 1, and Gwen is holding items, you're probably going to die. You just need to hit like everything. And it's just so hard to do when people just like load in and they have like Wukong 3, Jinx 3, and you have Fiora 1, Gwen 1, Karma 2. It's like, what are you going to do against that? They have Blitzcrank 3 that is just unkillable. And, you know, there's Ziggs 3, Kog'Maw 3, just like one taps your warriors and you're just out of damage. But I will say that this composition is so insane if you hit things like Spellcaster Toolbox for Gwen, if you hit Dark Alley Dealings for Fiora, if you hit What the Forge. There are some things that just make this comp like insanely high cap. So it's very good if you can get it online. It's just really hard to get there. The last composition A tier is Warwick Reroll. They did actually remove Corrupt Vampiric Scepter entirely, but they actually buffed Warwick to be as a viable carry even outside of it. And I think they did a pretty good job. Basically, your job with Warwick is to bully everybody on stage 3 and 4, and then fall off the cliff and land exactly in 4th place. I'm pretty sure the distribution of placements for Warwick is like 5% first, 10% second, 15% third, like 65% fourth, and then like the remaining placements in like 5th and 6th. It's like Warwick is just going to be so skewed to landing 4th. So just take your 4th and be happy with it. You don't need this rapid fire cannon. I've seen people go like double Rageblade and Titans. You go like Rageblade, Ginsu's, and Quicksilver. The best rating items for Warwick is Radiant Rageblade and Radiant Titans. Those are also good ways to play into Warwick. He also has like a handful of other like pretty decent artifacts, but I do want to call out one thing in particular is that Anger Issues is very good in the data. That is a composition that usually secures like a 2nd or 3rd. So make sure to pick up that Anger Issues and go triple woo with Warwick. And interesting enough, I actually made a video about no artifact Warwick. I didn't know that they were going to disable Corrupt Vampiric Scepter. So it's a video by Wajan Iverson that you can actually take a look of me VOD reviewing him and explaining how to actually, you know, get through all these plays without that CVS. B tier actually for the first time is kind of separated from C tier. I actually think it's a cut above a bunch of C tier comps. So let's go ahead and go through them. The first comp is playing around 8 Bastion Flex, which sounds weird because you're just basically playing 8 Bastions plus 2 units. But the idea is you kind of need to have insane econ and you need to hit the emblem. And that's just a very rare game. The second element is that you kind of need to have specific items. Like Archangels is really good for this comp because you need to stall out for your win condition. Like 8 Bastion just gives you 200 armor and MR, and the 2 champions in the back 2 rows are invulnerable until 4 Bastions die. So very fun comp to play to like stall out but you really want these like Archangels on Diana and Xerath, and you really need to get to 9 and hit these 2 stars, because even 1-star Diana, 1-star Xerath probably isn't good enough, and you just bleed out. I actually think that this is sort of like the AP version of Dragon Shapeshifters. Like, this is Dragon Shapeshifters, which is fast 9, and you have Smolder 1, Briar 1, and that's how you like stabilize until you hit 2 stars and win the game. And this is like the AD version, right? Like sword items, bow items. This is basically like the AP version of that, where Diana takes like, you know, the frontline melee, and Xerath takes like the AP tier backline. The most common way you get here is to play something like Scholar Bastion in the back, and you play like 6 Bastion with like Ahri Zoe early, and then you play into Ryze, like Ryze replaces Zoe, or you can play Zoe and Ryze and have Taric. So you have like a couple options there and try to get to 9. The other variation you can play is sort of like an old school Bastion Ophelio setup. If you guys remember from set 9, where you would play Targon, Taric, and Aphelios, and you played Bastions, and you just put double Rageblade and Last Whisper, and Aphelios would just like throw all the chakrams and just go crazy. This is basically that comp again. So Kalista is a multi-striker that links with Hecarim, and then you could link Akali with Pyro and Multistriker until you find Camille. That's like one way you can play. We'll probably add that as a variation as it picks up more steam. They buff Frost, so it is much more reliable. And if you find a Frost, it's actually, in my opinion, the best way to play Varus. I don't really like Varus by himself in other comps, but I do think that Frost Varus with Olaf is quite powerful, and kind of is basically like another variation of Faerie. The way to think about Frost Emblem is basically the same thing as a Faerie Crown that Kalista plays. It's just like a free damage item, and so it just gives you a lot of tempo to play around this. Also, something worth noting is that the jump from 2 to 3 Pyro is very high. It goes from 5 to 25%. So you're very much looking to get that attack speed, which is really huge jump. And so that's why a lot of people play Shen to get the Bastion with Diana late game. Another thing worth noting is that Olaf with Pyro Emblem is actually really good. Even if you don't have 5 Pyro, I actually looked at the stats. 7 Frost, 4 Pyro, Pyro Olaf still goes really, really hard. So definitely worth checking out if you ever have multiple spatulas. Speaking of Pyro, I think 5 Pyro is the best way to play Varus consistently, because you get to play the Smolder and Briar duo. Briar, a shapeshifter for Nasus, Smolder, a blaster for Varus. I think in China and Asia Pacific, they really like Pyro Briar in particular over Pyro on Smolder. So definitely check out Briar with the Pyro, because it could be very, very powerful when she like starts wailing onto the backline and executing them. The tricky thing about this composition is that you rarely find yourself in a spot to actually play it, because it feels like when you actually play it is like off of trait tracker, like more than anything else. Like you slam IE and you're angling like Arcana Varus, and then you just get like Pyro Emblem, and maybe get like a +1 shapeshifter, and maybe you get like, you know, a warrior emblem or something like that. Like you just like I've seen a lot of people actually play this off of trait tracker, or they get like a Pyro Crown in the mid game and they pivot. So like they're angling Jinx originally, and then they just get like a Pyro Emblem, so they pivot off of Jinx and they go into like Pyro instead. In general, I think Riot a little bit missed on Varus. I think he could have used a little bit, just a very tiny bit of love, and I think that would open up a lot of the metagame, because you don't really have that many good things to do with swords currently, and Varus is one of the few comps that actually wants swords for AD, and it's just not very reliable. So kind of here in B tier, because both of these comps that we show with Varus struggle with being on 1-star. If you're on 1-star Varus and you shoot like a 3-star, you know, Vex, like what are you gonna do? I mean, they'll just laugh at you. Thanks for feeding them mana. Like imagining Varus 1 firing into this, it's like it's like budget Disneyland fireworks show. Like, cool. You can also try to play 6 Blaster with Varus. 6 Blaster is still like an insane amount of damage, so it's just good. It's just rare that you end up in a spot where you can end up playing like Ezreal 3 primary and live long enough. It has like a issue where you're not going to win stage 2 and 3 very often, and it just takes a long time for you to get Ezreal 3, so you're probably not going to win stage 4. So it has a little bit of identity and tempo issues right now in the meta. In fact, this is probably closer to B- C+ tier, but we'll leave it here in B for now. 6 Hunters, Hunter. This is a really powerful comp still, but it kind of has the same issues with Shapeshifter Dragons, where you're just like gated by the 5 cost, and you really want Briar with Hunter or Smolder with Hunter, and it just has like a lower cap than those boards. So it just feels like the worst version of both the Dragon Shapeshifter and Wukong Jinx. I think the only time you ever want to play this is if you have a Hunter emblem very early on and you get dropped infinite swords and you just cannot find like bows for Jinx. Like, do not try to play Jinx with like Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, and nothing else. Like, that is just not going to work. So just abandon that, push levels, try to find Olaf 2, and get to 9 to look for Briar. Warriors are completely gated by the Warrior crest. If you get 6 Warriors, still really good. And in fact, I've played a handful of 6 Warrior games that I love, which are super fun. And I think what the cool thing about Warriors is you carry a different unit every single time. Like, some games I'm carrying Fiora Gwen, some games I'm carrying Cat 3, Akali 3, and like I said, Neela 3 got a lot better. So this was at one point the best comp in the game, but now it's just like a comp that can have high highs, but generally speaking, you can't play without the Warrior emblem. Shapeshifter Encanters used to be about Cassiopeia, but now we've kind of figured out that Cassiopeia's best comp, as we talked about, is actually in like a Ziggs duo scenario. This is usually where Cassio shines the most. In this composition, she's much more of a secondary carry behind Syndra, and Syndra's now the primary carry thanks to all the buffs. This, in my opinion, is like the weaker version of the Eldritch reroll that you go for Syndra 3, but I do think that this composition has potential. I do think you need to have like early mana items, plural, for Syndra, like a Mana Zane somehow with Spellcaster Toolbox, or just finding like Mana Zane off of a Portable Forge. Or you have like Shojin Nashers and you're like Syndra paired up. I think that's like a good way to actually start racking up Syndra. If you get Syndra to 120 cast, you very much will start dominating late game. If Ryze is the 4-cost nuker that can get to the back line and Hwei is the 3-cost variation of it, Syndra is basically the 2-cost. She'll just create that extra rift and bypass the front line and just end up doing a lot of AoE damage. Shapeshifter is just a really effective way to scale your board, and you have the late game cat with Briar. Plus, it's actually really good with something like 2 tanky. The board is Nico, Shiv, Syndra, and Cassio. The other variation you can play is Vanguard Syndra, but I think this is quite weak because it just requires so much to get online. It's not enough to have Syndra 3 and even more 3. You kind of want to hit like the Nora, Nami, Yumi for the support. And so this is like the old version that we used to play with Syndra. That was insane. I just don't think it works nearly as well anymore. But you can do it, and maybe you play 6 Vanguards instead. Maybe get +1 Vanguard. Don't play the mages. Just go 6 Vanguard Syndra, and it could probably work pretty well too. Last but not least for this video, Sugarcraft is a composition that is really insane because Sugarcraft Crown looks really good in the data. Looking at the data right now, Sugarcraft Crown is the only augment that averages better than a 4.0. I mean, just barely, but still, it's notable. It's the best augment to start off at 2-1. But I think those stats are fake because Sugarcraft Crown tends to be a bully of the meta. Like, it tends to punish unoptimal boards or suboptimal boards because everyone is giving free rounds to Sugarcraft. And Sugarcraft's like one of those things where if you give it 1 or 2 extra rounds, that is all the difference between it needs to cash out and scale. And then it just is the point of no return. So I do think that this composition is quite good if the stars align, but you're not going to get that game very often. So just be very mindful that it's a fun comp to play. It's very hard to pull off, but you definitely need to be mindful that the stats are a little bit fake here. I'm not going to talk much about C tier because they're all bad for a multitude of reasons, mainly because like Galio is really contested with mages, Rumble is really contested with every Vanguard, Spider Queen Unleashed just sucks. Solo Frontline Ezreal is a really funny comp, but like you only can play it off of like What the Forge or like, you know, some kind of crazy artifact anvil with Silvermere, and you somehow hit Ezreal. But 2 comps I want to call out. I do think Sweet Tooth Nunu is very good. Bastions are better for a reason, and Nunu is no exception. I don't think you play Honeymancy at all with him. Right now, the data says maybe you go Kog'Maw 3, but maybe you play, you know, Ahri instead. Just give it a try, like Nunu Ahri, and kind of just like play as a variation of this composition here. And the other is Pillar Flame because you guessed it, 6 Bastions really good. So, you know, give Bastions a try with Shen hero augment. I'm pretty sure the win rate of this augment is really high. For some reason, we have 5 Bastion. Okay, probably cut Nasus and play another Bastion. Sorry about that. The win rate of this augment is actually pretty high. It's much higher than almost any other hero augment. So, out of all of the hero augments, I think this one has the potential to take first the most. And just like that, a full set of tier lists done in the books. You know, set 12 balance wasn't all there, but I really enjoyed Charms' mechanic. I think the patch is in a decent spot right now, and overall, I think the set had a ton of potential. It could have been one of the like my favorite sets of all time because I think Charms might be the best mechanics they've done since, you know, portals and augments. But in the end, I think that it ends up being like a solid B for me. It just had potential to be like A+, maybe even S-. Set 13, by the way, is in just a couple of weeks. So my next tier list video will be for the next set of TFT, which is crazy. Just another new set just like that. Whew, what a whirlwind. A really big shout out to everyone who also supports my content over at Twitch, as well as TFT Academy. We're going to be taking it to the next level for set 13 and beyond. So a big thank you for everyone who both subscribes here and supports our Patreon to get a bunch of exclusive content. Thanks for all the support and love, guys, and I'll see you guys next set.